Hello, dear viewers. After a fairly long break, the line of contact is back with you. In today's dialogue between our permanent experts of the events of the week rubric of Farhad Mammadov and Areg Kochinyan will be conducted by me, Boris Navashardian. My Armenian colleague Arshovis Mbisian is absent today for a good reason, but he is in the team and you will meet him again. From this day on, our programs will be broadcast on the joint Armenian Azerbaijani media platform Press Club STV, founded by the Baku and Yerevan press clubs. The episodes of our columns will be alternately broadcast from the Yerevan and Baku studios of Press Club STV. Although this issue is published under the heading Events of the Week, taking into account our long absence from the air, we have had the last 7 days stretched for many weeks, and we will try to discuss all the main things that happened during this time. My first question is to Farhad. Recent months have been full of numerous, one might say, epoch-making events in relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The list of places where meetings of ideologies took place at the highest level in Abu Dhabi, Washington, Sharm el-Sheikh, Dushanbe say a lot. But I will allow myself modesty and ask, what, in your opinion, is the place of our initiative line of contact in this whole process? Please, Farhad.
Thank you very much. I would note that, of course, there are many projects in which Azerbaijani and Armenian experts are involved, and in most cases they take place abroad. And in most cases, even in the overwhelming majority, these are closed meetings. The maximum is, well, 1 or 2 photos and no more. The project, therefore, is the line of contact, and the project that is being implemented by the press clubs of Azerbaijan and Armenia, it is open, that is, it is transparent. And there are open discussions on a weekly basis, in which dozens of experts take part. That is, in addition to personal meetings, these are actually weekly contacts. Therefore, when the situation, so to speak, matured, the implementation of the media project, it showed its effectiveness in the sense that both Azerbaijani and Armenian experts already have experience of communicating not only behind closed doors, but also in an open mode. That is through the media. This, of course, saves us as much time as possible in discussions, because at least we know the agenda that the Armenian side is proposing, and the Armenian side understands what the Azerbaijani side can say to certain issues. This is very important. In addition, there is the involvement of the public, that is, the active part that follows the processes, forms its opinion, and accordingly knows these programs both by sight and by content. Therefore, I think that these meetings and the situation that we have now, which allows representatives of civil society to get involved, to be actively involved, therefore, in these processes, our program is a project of press clubs. It has its own, well, role in the fact that all this is being promoted. And it may not be accidental that the participants of the program were participants in the meeting in Yerevan.
Thank you, Farhad. Oleg, of course, you can add something on the same topic, but first of all, I would like to hear from you your assessment of the events in the meetings already mentioned, and the documents signed in Washington, and the opening of the territory of Azerbaijan for the supply of Kazakh grain to Armenia. And, finally, the recent communication that Farhad mentioned at the level of Armenian-Azerbaijani civil diplomacy in Yerevan and much more. But since much has already been said about this, let's approach the topic from the following angle. Can we talk about a progressive process with an internal unified logic, where each step is thought out and leads to a common goal?
Well, first of all, I agree with all the arguments of my colleague regarding this initiative, and initiatives in general between civil societies and expert circles of both countries. I definitely believe that this is very important. We need to continue working on it. And, in particular, this initiative, which differs from everything else in that it is public. In other words, there are a lot of such closed meetings now. But in order to involve the wider public sector in this and share our thoughts with the wider public circles of both countries, this is probably the only platform where this is possible. Now about your question. You know, I think that this is the general logic or the general chain of events. It developed in the process. That is, I do not think that when there was, for example, the very first such meeting, in my opinion, one of the most important meetings in Abu Dhabi, then it was already clear. It was clear what would happen. There would be such a process, then there would be Washington, then Copenhagen, then a grain carrier. What happened with grain? No. That is, initially, there was no such architecture for the construction of this process, in my opinion. But in the process, everything went exactly along the chain. That is, each subsequent meeting, each subsequent development, it was connected or connected with the previous one. And the continuation of this chain, it can become the new architecture that we need. That is, I believe that both governments, both leaders have shown sufficient wisdom and sufficient will, so that, despite the rather turbulent geopolitical situation in the world and a sufficient number of, you know, these are options for disrupting these processes, first of all, to preserve some autonomy of this process from all others. That is, now I do not think that there is any power center in the world that has, well, such a fatal significance or influence on our process. In a sense, our process has become autonomous. It is precisely the process between Yerevan and Baku. There are power centers that have a certain amount of influence on this process. This, it is impossible without it. But the most important thing is that there is much more autonomy here than the influence of anyone else. This is another important point. And, finally, the third point that I would emphasize here. Here I will repeat a phrase that my colleague repeated in many of our conversations. You need to be closer to each other. The denser it is, the less room there will be for third forces, which often, follow their own interests, not often, but always, in general, and also for those forces for which peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan is directly disadvantageous.
И также для тех сил, для которых напрямую просто мир между Арменией и Азербайджаном не выгоден.
There are such forces in the world, such forces exist in our region. Such forces, in my opinion, even exist in our countries. But these are the forces, those people who are at the moment and also in the governments that share the peace agenda and should continue their work.
Thank you, Areg. Farhad, well, of course, we can afford to be extremely optimistic, but, for example, the Azerbaijani delegation did not arrive in Yerevan for the plenary session of the Euronest of the Eastern Partnership Parliamentary Assembly. At the summit of the European political community in Yerevan in May next year, Ilham Aliyev is also unlikely to be expected. This means that there are still some obstacles to contacts. Of course, with regard to Euronest, it can be said that the reason was not the venue of Yerevan, but Baku's attitude towards the European Parliament. However, in 2024, the Azerbaijani delegation was present at the plenary session of Euronest in Brussels. And if you look at the history of these meetings at all, then there was a boycott by Baku only twice. In 2015 and 2025, exactly when Euronest met in Yerevan. It turns out that, does the blocking of the Euronest plenary sessions in 2015 and 2025, when it was held in Yerevan, mean something or not, do you think?
Well, since our last meetings, in principle, Areg has outlined the main elements. We must treat this process, the achievements that we have, quite responsibly. I think that the governments of our countries are serious and responsible about the process that was initiated in a bilateral format, confirmed in Washington. And during this period after the beginning of August, it develops at its own pace, expanding the spheres and deepening these spheres. That is, this is an important element that needs to be noted. We should, I think, avoid events that could be interpreted differently or harm the process. Yes, on the topic of Euronest, this is a contradiction between Azerbaijan and the European Parliament. And we know that these contradictions are based on the resolutions adopted by the European Parliament, and which do not respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Republic of Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijani delegation could take part in this at this meeting. But what would we get? In other words, it would be positive that Azerbaijani parliamentarians flew to Yerevan, to Armenia. This is a series of events. But I assure you that the discussions and the issues that would have been raised there would have led to statements that would have caused, I think, harm to the overall process. Because we saw that there were initiatives, we saw how the ruling party, the representative of the ruling party, voted at the Euronest meeting. And imagine that all this would also be with the participation of Azerbaijani parliamentarians. I think all this needs to be weighed. As for the European political community and Hikmet Hajiyev's statement that Azerbaijan will not participate, it means that it will participate at the highest level. Our process is underway. It is going its own way, as it were, and we are well aware that today the terms of de facto peace are actually guaranteed by a joint statement. And the leaders, again, take this statement seriously and responsibly. Let me remind you of the question of an Armenian journalist in Washington and President Aliyev's answer that if it were not for this seriousness, they would not have flown to the #1 country and to the #1 office of the strongest and most respected president in the world. Yes, Mr. Trump, for which we are. And through your transmission, thank you. Otherwise, it will go beyond the generally accepted rules in the world already. But no one said that Azerbaijan would not take part at high level. That is, if he does not take part in the summit of the European political community at the highest level, then no one says that there will be no high level. And this is the level, for example, of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Azerbaijan, which will also be regarded in a series of these events. And within the framework of the European political community, there are no documents, resolutions, and so on, which the discussion of which can damage the overall peace process. Therefore, here I think that today the absence of the Azerbaijani delegation to Euronest is, firstly, the reason is the contradiction with the European Parliament, and secondly, this is the absence of so that there would be no risk for the peace process, especially if even there are more European parliamentarians, yes, who have the same, yes, agenda, a more conflicting agenda than now. The next element is, of course, the participation of representatives of Azerbaijan and Armenia in international events held at each other. And in this regard, I think there's a dialogue. In this regard, there's an understanding that these topics are no longer subject to any prohibitions or lack of invitations. In other words, we are trying to turn the page somehow, and the number of people, which means Armenian citizens visiting Azerbaijan and Azerbaijani citizens visiting Armenia, will grow.
Well, let's wait for Mr. Bayramov in Yerevan in May 2026. And we, having mentioned Euronest, gradually moved on to the main meaning of our column event of the week. And last week, Areg, there were some more interesting reports about plans for the near future. Well, first of all, changes have been made to the composition of the Armenian Commission dealing with the unblocking of communications, and the visit of Donald Trump Jr., the eldest son of the U.S. president, whom Farhad mentioned, is expected. How can you comment on these events? You can, of course, return to the topic of Euronest, if you have something to add.
There is nothing to add on the topic of Euronest. On the topic of communications, well, this is definitely a deepening and expansion of the process. In other words, the more serious the discussion on unblocking communications on railways, highways and other infrastructures, the more relevant agencies and specialists should be involved in this process.
Тем больше профильных ведомств, тем больше специалистов должны быть вовлечены в этот процесс.
In my opinion, this is quite a positive element, given that, for example, people were involved, representatives of the road department. That is, this is the department that works on the construction of highways, roads in Armenia and other relevant departments. This, of course, is more of a technical level than a political one. But in general, we are smoothly moving into the phase when we are entering the phase of technical implementation of all these treaties and representations from political statements, from political negotiations. Of course, the most such flagship project continues to be TRIP. But I would say that in parallel with TRIP, you can and should do other things that can have a positive impact on the process, on the speed of TRIP construction. For example, if the Yerevan-Sardarak section is repaired, that is, if Nakhichevan is connected to the Armenian railway, then in a few months Azerbaijan will have the opportunity to connect through the Georgian railway, through the north of Armenia, the Armenian railway to Nakhichevan.
Подключиться через пока что грузинскую железную дорогу, через север Армении, армянскую железную дорогу к Нахичевани.
Why is this important? And, since one way or another, and TRIP he now implies, firstly, the construction of an Azerbaijani railway to the Armenian eastern border, then the construction of a railway to Megri, then about 10 kilometers west of the Armenian border on the territory of Nakhichevan itself, it will also need to be rebuilt. And already the modernization of the Nakhichevan railway itself. This, well, at best, will take 5 or 6 years, in my opinion. And if we also connect from the north, then we will already have a double front of work. That is, it will be possible for both sides to build and work on the TRIP project. That's it, that's the first question. As for Donald Trump Jr., I don't know if he should also be thanked or not. And to be honest, I don't really understand the reason for his arrival yet. There may be different versions. For example, here, this is how we discuss some domestic political topic, some topic, and the topic of TRIP. That is, well, let's wait and see for what reason Donald Trump Jr. comes to Yerevan.
Farhad, Areg has already mentioned that it is desirable to have a symmetrical, yes, or parallel restoration and construction of railways that will connect Armenia and Azerbaijan and continue further for the transportation of transit goods. And in this sense, it is interesting to hear your comment on the statement of the assistant to the president of Azerbaijan that Azerbaijan is actively attracting potential partners and investors for the restoration of the Nakhichevan railway. If this happens, it is clear that the whole process will speed up, become actually parallel to what is happening, in the matter of trip. And we are well aware that if we are talking about, say, such a partner as the European Union, this means that the restoration of the Nakhichevan Railway will also necessarily mean the connection of Siderek with Yerevan. That is, if I am not mistaken, this 4-kilometer section, which will allow the Nakhichevan Railway to be extended to Gyumri in Armenia. Further, let's hope, the Armenian-Turkish border will be opened, and the continuation will be along the Gyumri-Kars line. Yes, the railway there also requires a certain restoration. What can you say about this?
Well, the topic of railways is relevant now, because when talking about transport communication routes, first of all, they think about railways because, firstly, it requires maximum investment. Roads, they also require investment, but they exist. And it is easier to lay asphalt from one point to another than, of course, to build a railway. Well, pipelines, power lines are, I think, the next, stage of opening communications. For example, the railway needs to be built, and it takes time. If Azerbaijan has already begun to focus on the railways of Nakhichevan at this stage, this means that there is an understanding that
то это означает, что есть понимание того, что
TRIP project, it will acquire its practical contours in the very near future. That is, both the mode of operation and the immediate start of infrastructure work to create this infrastructure. Oh, the topic of Nakhichevan. In principle, there's a railway there, but while it is clear that it has not been actively used during these 3 decades. Speaking about modernization, I once asked specialists, they said, well, we call it modernization, but in fact, a lot will need to be done from scratch. That is, work on strengthening under the roadbed, because it is expected that there will be large tonnage cargo, and the alarm system, and the system, therefore, electrification, and so on. That is, this is a large amount of work. If Azerbaijan attracts attention, then foreigners, who may have positions, interests, and so on. I think that you have already outlined the European Union here. And in principle, the European Union independently expresses its position that they're going to help the unblocking process. And in what form will be done? There are 3 mechanisms here. This is a direct investment mechanism, a lending mechanism, and a grant mechanism. And accordingly, the special representative of the European Union for the region visited Nakhichevan during her previous visit. A second visit is expected soon to understand how much it costs, how to deal with it, what capacities will be used. Along with this, of course, Azerbaijan has its own vision. This is also the attraction, possibly, of loans, because if it is an investment, then the investment implies that the investor would own in some form what he is investing. Azerbaijan has no practice today when someone would question the state monopoly on railways. Therefore, I'm a little skeptical about investments. It is possible to lend from international financial institutions, or, therefore, through interaction with the states of the Middle East. That is, they should be interested in this regard because they still invest in the development of green energy in Azerbaijan. But the power line is along this road. That is, to show how possible it is to form your own opinion, position on the consortium, and so on. This is all very important. Where will this road go next? Well, it is clear that these pieces of the puzzle that are now trying to make them come together, and moreover, to develop our government that implies several projects. Here is the first part. This is along the Araz River to the border with Armenia. Azerbaijan is already implementing this. And in principle, Hikmet Hajiyev showed this directly with photographs, and the diplomatic corps was shown it at the end of last week. Then it's Trip, then it's Nakhchivan. Nakhchivan is 3 parts. This is from the border with Armenia to Orjabad. In my opinion, there is no railway there at all today. And from Orjabad, here is Satarak. This is along the Araz River, and then there's a branching along our position. Here is the new Nakhchivan-Kars road, but it is still under construction. There's still work to take at least 4 or 5 years. And the most realistic is the entrance to the territory of the Republic of Armenia. And here, of course, this 4-kilometer section should also be logically considered, so that if we go according to plan for 2 or 2.5 years, then it is realistic, of course, to send the first cargo from there. And then carriers will look again, private structures will look at it, the European Union will look at who will give guarantees, insurance, and so on for which roads. That is, states will simulate this process minimally. When you have several roads, the carriers themselves decide through the territory of which country this cargo will be sent. Here, the topic of competition already happens. That is, what tariff scale will be provided by a particular country. Digitalization. Well, there are 3 such, yes, pillars of the competitiveness of transport routes. This is security, these are tariffs, that is, how much money it will be, and bureaucratic, which means delays. The less bureaucracy there is, the more goods pass through these countries. Together with our partner from Georgia and Kazakhstan, well, for how many years we have been discussing this, we are only now reaching the point of digitalizing the use of the single window system, so that companies would pay at the very beginning and would not think that at some customs crossings there are some subjective problems. Yes, they do occur. This should no longer be a problem for manufacturers and buyers of goods. I think that in this regard, yes, a lot of work will have to be done, but only after agreements are reached on the decisions, on the main decisions on the creation of infrastructure.
The time has come for us to talk a little about the public mood around everything that is happening on the Armenian-Azerbaijani track and, in particular, about the reaction to the first Azerbaijani plane, which landed at the Armenian airport in Yerevan, about the meeting that followed this landing.
В армянском Ереванском аэропорту, о самой встрече, последовавшей после этой посадки.
And I would also like you, Areg, to tell us, if you know what can be expected in the near future. We understand that recent months have been full of surprises, but I think that there are also some planned initiatives and events.
Well, about the plane that arrived in Yerevan. I am the person who met this plane on the runway. Of course, everyone at the airport was very surprised to see a board with the inscription, Azerbaijan, with large letters on this board. Well, to say that they were surprised, this, of course, is to put it mildly. The second point, the technical specialists at the airport told me that, in general, they had never seen such a plane at the Yerevan airport. And the fact that there was a direct Baku-Yerevan flight of Azerbaijani or Armenian airlines, this has also not happened since time immemorial, well, in general, in any case, for a very long time. This is exactly on the board, which means that it flew to Yerevan. You know, I believe that the initiative that began in Yerevan is extremely important for two reasons. First, very often during official talks, whether in Washington, in Abu Dhabi, or most recently in Copenhagen, leaders and governments talk about the need to pull society up. It is necessary to prepare society for peace, for coexistence, and so on. Well, this is the very first such practical step in this direction. What is very important, the initiative, on both sides, was on the part of society, and it was supported by the governments of both countries. As I said, this is only the first meeting. My colleagues and I have agreed that for a certain period of time, we will design projects, we will agree on some projects, on some specific initiatives, and we will work on them, in the direction, of these projects. Of course, there will be follow-up meetings. These meetings will take place on a reciprocal basis, that is, every other time on each other's territory. This is the second point. And, finally, there is another equally important, in my opinion, factor of the significance of this project. As far as I can see, very often during official negotiations, the parties, due to objective and subjective restrictions, are afraid to introduce new topics, new ideas, new projects into the circulation of negotiations.
Опасаются вводить новые темы, новые идеи, новые проекты в оборот переговоров.
Not that this never happens, but both sides have certain concerns about this. And such platforms, in fact, in my opinion, are an ideal option for discussing such new ideas, for, let's say, feeling the ground.
Для, скажем так, прочувствования почвы.
What will be the reaction of the parties to this idea, to the implementation of such and such a project, for example? And, finally, there is a moment. Starting at a certain point, in my opinion, it is Abu Dhabi. Second track or track 1.5. That is, the experts, civil society, I don't know there, the intelligentsia, the media, they are far behind the official negotiations. If, for example, before Abu Dhabi, we could more or less say that there was some kind of synchronicity in these processes, then, starting with Abu Dhabi, it means that the negotiations simply rushed forward, at an unprecedented pace, in general. And in both countries, and on both sides, not only in these tracks, not only in these conversations, let's say, between societies, but in general, political thought seems to lag behind the pace of these negotiations. That is, for example, I look at Armenian experts who talk about something for Armenian society, I look at Azerbaijani experts who talk to Azerbaijani society, and I very often see that these people, they seem to have lost their pulse, they do not feel the pace and how far they have come.
Потеряли пульс, они не чувствуют вот тот темп и то, насколько дальше прошли.
Negotiations went ahead. This, in my opinion, needs to be changed, because the pace is really wild, and you need to deal with it, to catch up with it, and sometimes even better to overtake. Because what else can be the positive element of such meetings? As I said, yes, these are some ideas, some projects that may be of interest, which means official talks. That's it. As for how, then, what the atmosphere was, what was the atmosphere there, I don't know, conversations, I think it would be better to ask the guests.
Yes, of course. We will also ask Farhad what he thinks about all this. But I would also like to add that, on about the same days, or if not at all on the same days when we met in Yerevan, a meeting of representatives of the two think tanks took place in Istanbul, and literally in the next 2 days the Orbeli Forum will be held, at which Azerbaijani guests will also be present and speak.
Пройдет Орбели форум, на котором будут присутствовать и выступать также азербайджанские гости.
That is, the innovative nature and the addition of some new ideas to the process of normalization of relations on the part of civil diplomacy, it is, of course, very important. But we are well aware that the process of this normalization is quite fragile and associated with some risks. Therefore, I would like Farhad, speaking about the reaction to what has already happened, perhaps also mentioning what these risks are and to what extent, the second track, normalization of relations can stop these risks, if we can be so immodest as to assume that it can.
Нормализация отношений может купировать эти риски, если мы можем быть настолько нескромными, чтобы предположить, что может.
This is an interesting and important question because on our programs within the framework of the Press Clubs project, we always try to somehow assess the current situation and make a small forecast there to step half a step forward. Of course, there are these risks, both internal and external. But after the Washington meeting, when there is an agreed peace agenda, that is something that could be agreed upon, and this is enough, so to speak, fundamental, so to speak, achievements, they create a space for the implementation of certain. Initiatives, including within the framework of civil society. At the same time, these agreements have increased the sovereignty of our countries in the region and the ability to manage the projection of external power in our region in some form in a coordinated manner. At the very least, to remove the negativity there of the use of the countries of the region against each other or the substitution of national interests. Today, this achievement exists. Therefore, I think the main risk will be that the peace process, if it loses momentum and the participants who have adopted this peace agenda, they will lose power in their countries. This is a risk within countries, which also has an impact on the activity of external actors. In this context, of course, the parliamentary elections in Armenia are, one might say, the only electoral process in the near future. Well, for the future, probably for 5 years, which can affect the implementation of the peace agenda between Azerbaijan and Armenia. In Azerbaijan, presidential elections have been held, and the parliament has been formed. Accordingly, the most important elections in Armenia are the parliamentary elections. Another important element is if certain groups in society, of course, some are used to conflict and do not want to leave this environment. Some are subjective. Yes, this is a political agenda to oppose the peace agenda, because, for example, it is implemented by the Prime Minister of Armenia or the President of Azerbaijan.
У кого-то субъективная, да, это политическая повестка выступать против мирной повестки, потому что, например, это реализовывает премьер-министр Армении или же президент Азербайджана.
And in Azerbaijan, there's also such negative content, which is formed both in the country and abroad from these Azerbaijani bloggers, for example. That is, we must work with all this. And this first reaction to the visit of representatives of civil society, in principle, this will become, I think, the subject of our discussions in order to see in what form it is, in what form, plus what the positive consists of. That is, peace to the world, or people sincerely want the war not to happen again, or they simply want to live in peace, or on the contrary, they want to get benefits from this peace. In other words, the supporters and people who spoke in favor of continuing this peace agenda, expanding and deepening it, they also have their own motives, and we must also work with this. I think that the main function that is now in place in the next, one might say, 6 months is to bring the maximum amount of information to our society about the peace agenda. I think that today we have a risk that this process can be reversed. We must actively work to approach the period when this process will become irreversible both in Azerbaijan and in Armenia. And with this, first of all, our society will have to understand this, and external actors will have to get used to it, that there will be no spokes in the wheels in any form anywhere. There will not even be such an opportunity to do this.
Well, we will try. Areg, what risks do you see from Yerevan? We heard how all this is perceived in Baku. What is in Armenia? What are the moods of society? What are the new dangers and risks that require a response from our side as well?
Boris, do you mean the risks to negotiations in general or the risks to the platform we have just talked about?
I am referring to the process of normalizing relations in general, including the civil track.
Good. In general, I would say, well, on the one hand, there are specific political forces in Armenia, specific political circles that fundamentally disagree with everything that is happening, who do not share the peace agenda. And they are actively, very actively generating, which means that all this is impossible. There will be no peace. Peace is impossible. Here is all this rhetoric. This is the first point. The second point is, of course, a fairly large percentage of the population in Armenia has a lack of trust in the process. That is, if the first one is specifically negative, then there is no such negative, but there is a very strong distrust. I think the same is present in Azerbaijani society for the process. Well, in general, this is a fairly natural field after such a protracted conflict. This is the second point. These two, I would say, are now the biggest threat to the peace process in Armenia. Why? Because, well, obviously, very soon, we have less than 10 months left, parliamentary elections and the issue of war and peace, the issue of the peace process. It has already become a key issue in the upcoming parliamentary elections, I would say. Along with 2 or 3 other issues, it is definitely one of the key issues. That is, along with 2 or 3 other issues, it will affect what kind of government will be formed in Armenia. This is the first point. Of the non-Armenian processes, that is, outside the borders of Armenia, which, in my opinion, still continue to have some level of threat in relation to the process, then first of all, the Russian Federation.
Иметь какой-то уровень угрозы по отношению к процессу, то в первую очередь Российская Федерация. Я считаю, что из стратегических интересов России не исходит нормализация между Арменией и Азербайджаном с одной стороны.
And normalization between Armenia and Turkey, on the other hand. And Russia will try in every possible way to prevent this normalization.
Не допустить вот этой нормализации.
This is the second point. The third point. The world is a pretty turbulent place right now. There are a variety of conflict situations, there are crises. So far, both Armenia and Azerbaijan have proved that, whether it is conflicts that are far from us, for example, the India-Pakistan conflict or the Israel-Iran conflicts, which are geographically close to us, this, in general, has had a zero impact on the process, on the pace of normalization between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In other words, we have been able to stop this so far, but it continues to be a threat to the process of normalizing relations. Here, turbulence, let's say, in international relations is the third point. And the fourth point. In my opinion, the most important. I see that there is a tendency towards this, to the feeling that we are in the same boat. As soon as this becomes the dominant opinion that the peace process is just like a boat in a raging river, which we, together with Azerbaijan, Armenia and Azerbaijan must somehow, bypassing these waves and obstacles, bring to such a calm place. This is the most important change that we are now moving towards. That is, not competitiveness in this process, although competitiveness is still an integral part of international relations. Without this you can't get anywhere. But it is in the peace process that the formulation, the form, is to formulate the dominant view that in this process we are in the same boat. One will drown, and the other will drown. Revival of the conflict, it will not give, no matter what it is now, what component of the balance of power in the South Caucasus it is, will not allow the other to develop normally.
Well, I think we will be able to monitor in the course of our broadcasts how calm we are, how we will be able to adequately respond to all these risks. And thank you, Areg and Farhad. Thank you very much, our dear viewers, for being with us, and I hope that there will be no longer breaks in our initiative line of contact. And we will meet on the new Press Club TV channel this week. All the best.